Great, thanks. So just one more point on heat pumps, just to be clear. So heat pumps, so everybody's on the same page, are technologies that come in and can really reduce our fossil fuel consumption. They're electric powered, they're hyper efficient devices that can heat and cool our homes. And they work by kind of moving energy from the energy in the ambient air and condensing it and then putting it from outside into inside and then releasing that indoors. So they're really efficient. Years ago, we used to ban electric resistance heating in homes. Our codes actually have changed over the years to allow electric, not electric resistance, but to allow electric heating sources in homes and 100% electric homes, because it is 2.5, 3 times as efficient as electric resistance. But it doesn't mean that there's no electric impact. And if we go to the next slide, I wanted to kind of show you. This is this slide's a little dated, but I still put it in here anyway because it illustrates the point. And this is information that ISO New England, or that actually EPRI put together a few years ago about the ISO New England grid. It's the Electric Power Research Institute, and showed kind of in New England the load profile across the course of a year was relatively flat, I guess. A little high in the winter, a summer peak, like we use the most energy in the summer in 2015 regionally. And on the bottom there, the chart shows kind of that same hourly profile of New England, but it assumes electrification. And you can see that we have a winter peak now, and we moved kind of the shape of when our usage happens the most into the winter. And a lot of that has to do with heat pumps and then some electric vehicles also. And so again, you kind of understand the trends of kind of the shaping of our demand and when it happens kind of on an annual basis, and then we'll even get into on an hourly basis, because that impacts the types of generation you might be looking for, characteristics of generation you might be looking for. Okay, so our next slide, slide 17. What electricity do Vermont utilities generate or buy? So this is a chart of the amount of purchases of electricity to meet the demand of customers. This is different than retail sales. So those annual demand charts that I showed you before were retail sales. So that's the sale of electricity to the ultimate consumer. This slide is the actual purchases of the utility. And so the total amount of purchases is bigger than what they sell to customers. And that's because of line losses, mostly because of line losses, on the distribution and transmission system that are about 6 or 7%. So this 5.8 million megawatt hours of electricity was purchased in 2021. And about 5.2, 5.3 million megawatt hours of electricity was delivered to customers. On the purchases, this chart shows the amount either that our electric utilities own or have contracted with for purchase. And you can see the green are what's defined as renewable by 30 VSA 8002. And we have about a little less than a quarter of statewide purchases are entitlements. I'll use the word entitlements to cover both purchases and ownership. Entitlements are from Hydro-Quebec and another 12% from other hydropower in New England and New York. Little less than 10% each from wind. You think Sheffield and Lowell, but also there's contracts with resources in in New Hampshire and Maine. Biomass is McNeil and Reigate, the 20 megawatt power plant in Reigate. And then in solar, which comes from net metering, our standard offer program, and then just straight contracts with solar plants.
Representative Pat?
Just a quick question. Where, in which category does oh, no, I just see it now. Never mind. I was asking about landfill, but
Right.
it's hanging on the bottom of the chart. Got it. Never mind.
Yep. So we mentioned nuclear earlier. That's 19% of our entitlements are from nuclear. And then there's unspecified. So that is the power that we purchase on the market, basically. So we have entitlements. So if we had 100 megawatt hours of demand, we have entitlements here for 83 megawatt hours of that demand. And then when we don't have enough entitlements to meet that demand, we kind of make up the difference from that wholesale energy marketplace that ISO New England runs. And there's no resource specified here because it's just kind of designated as system power. It's not you can't assign any one megawatt hour to it. It's just you're purchasing energy at a certain point on the system. You can purchase it in different places, but it's not necessarily natural gas or nuclear or Hydro-Quebec. Usually we'll get into the attributes of power. Do we do that in the first part? Probably a little this afternoon. We'll get into the attributes of power and how we account for kind of what's left and what's in that system mix and what's in that unspecified mix and what we count for our actual resources as it relates to our greenhouse gas emissions and our regulatory compliance to our renewable energy standard.
Does ISO have renewable goals?
ISO does not have renewable policy goals. All the states have policy goals. And so ISO New England just operates markets. And there's actually been a lot of discussions over the years of if they should operate those markets, kind of how much of public policy should go into them operating the markets. Should they just do them, excuse me, based on straight economics, which is largely what they do now, or are there other public policy factors that they should kind of overlays that they should put into place to account for our state's policy? We advocate at the Department of Public Service, we advocate in those matters two ways. We participate in some of those committee meetings for ISO New England. We also advocate through, it's called the New England States Committee on Electricity. It's a group of state representatives that specifically advocates. And we also work with our electric utilities and Velco to advocate for kind of state policy and what benefits Vermont in those markets.
Representative Satkowitz.
Thank you. In the unspecified category, presumably we have historical data, like maybe averages over the last several years of what that mix is. So wouldn't that give us at least a good sense of what we might be using in the near term from those sources?
Oh yeah, so it's not on this chart, and I'll get into it a little bit more. There's what's called the there's the, I guess I have it in the appendix, so I don't have it in front of me, but there's what New England operates as a whole. And then when we get into the renewable energy standard, we'll talk about renewable energy credits and attributes of the power. Even non-renewable sources are assigned an attribute, and that attribute is tracked. And if nobody claims that attribute, and distribution utilities claim renewable attributes or nuclear attributes because they want to call themselves clean or they want to meet their renewable portfolio standard obligations. Anything that's not claimed then falls into kind of the residual mix. And that is what this unspecified really is. And that most of the time, nobody's claiming natural gas, right? Also, a lot of the time, nobody's claiming nuclear. There's nobody wants to say, I'm paying for, or I'm retiring this natural gas attribute or this oil attribute. They're retiring and claiming the renewable attributes. So that probably isn't a full answer to your question. I think we do know what is in the unspecified, and want to just get into it a little more this afternoon, if that's okay. So to answer your earlier question, you can see here in terms of our entitlements, we have about 36% of our power comes from is contracted or owned hydropower.
Representative Sibilia.
Yeah, I think, I just want to say, I think I heard Representative Smith ask for in-state hydro.
Okay,
And that's in-state and out of state.
correct. Yes. So this afternoon, I will,
Actually, no, it
Hydro-Quebec
says
and
hydropower.
well, Hydro-Quebec is out of state.
So
That's
the rest of the
imported.
hydropower is in?
in New England.
Okay.
And some of it's New York, there's some of it's in Vermont, Connecticut River, some of it, but it's not. So this doesn't represent, for instance, there's a number of plants on the Connecticut River, maybe 200, 300 megawatts of capacity. Our utilities have contracts for some of that power, but not all of it. And so the portion that we have contracts for that power are represented here. The rest of that power is not represented here in this chart.
Just letting that sink in for a second. Representative Smith.
Thank you. Do you feel that you would be able to sit where you are and say, we could provide all of our power through Hydro-Quebec? I know there's an awful lot of water up there.
Well, not today we can't, because there's not the transmission infrastructure to get it here. And so, theoretically, if you could just site enough transmission lines and Hydro-Quebec was a willing partner to contract with, then technically that would be possible. But there's a lot of hurdles to get there. In Maine, Central Maine Power just tried to build a transmission line to bring maybe 1,000 or 1,200 megawatts of power into New England, into Maine, and it couldn't get sited. I don't particularly think the utility did a good job in its outreach and working with communities to get it sited, but it turned into a big political hot button item, and it ultimately was not approved. And so even just the siting of that type of infrastructure to get power that at combustion doesn't have any greenhouse gas emissions, then it is a challenge, and that could be low cost power. That answer your question?
It does, thank you.
Okay.
Morris.
Thank you. TJ, thank you. That main line, was that the Labrador Newfoundland project or?
I am not positive, actually.
And under hydropower, community I live in has 4 hydro dams, and that power goes, I think goes to Green Mountain Power, goes into the distribution. So that's included, you think?
That would be included in here, yes. Yep. Yeah, anything that is either owned by the utility or contracted by the utility, or there's even some small hydro facilities that are net metered, and those would count in here also. So you said 10:20 earlier?
Well, we took a break. I was thinking that would be so we have till 10:30 now.
Okay. So we'll go over some electric rates. So slide 18, please. So all of that generation and transmission that we just talked about goes into is one component of the electric rate structure. So when you have your bill and you're paying your monthly bill, there's a number of different things that go into that. So what we just talked about, the generation and the transmission of power, distribution of power to you, is about, collectively, that's about 60% of the electric utilities rates. The other pieces of that are, operations and maintenance of the distribution line, kind of the administration of the utility, billing, et cetera. And then about 20% is capital costs. And so that varies by utility. So, for publicly owned utilities have a lower capital cost, cost to borrow money than investor-owned utilities. And that's because they're, a municipal utility gets municipal rates, they could bond, they just have a lower cost to borrow than an investor-owned utility that is looking to shareholders for half of its capital funding. So that one varies, but statewide, about a little less than a quarter of the cost is kind of paying debt or equity costs. So recently, we've had a number of rate cases. I'm sure many of you have constituents who have had rate cases from their electric utility, proposals to increase the rates. And so just want to give you a quick sense of like the regulatory process of what happens when a utility finds that the revenues they're collecting from their customers aren't enough to pay their costs. So at the top on the left, we have the rate filing that starts. Within 30 days, needs to do an initial review, and anybody can do it, but really we're the ones that take an initial review and make a recommendation to the Public Utility Commission as to whether there should be an open investigation. So, there may be a small rate increase for 0.5% or something that we say, okay, they've justified this in their initial filing. It's a pretty clear-cut case. We don't need to investigate this. Most of the time, I'd say 95, 99% of the time, we end up investigating an increase for a rate increase request. And so what happens,
Here it is.
oh, sorry. Yep. If we don't, I should say, if we don't ask for an increase, then those rates go into effect in 45 days. If we do ask for a rate investigation, then that can take up to 7 months for those rates to actually be approved. And there's a whole lot of regulatory terms on this slide. There's a period of time where we or any party can ask questions of the utility and discovery, get a lot more information on why they requested the increase. The utility files pre-filed testimony, and we then file testimony with the commission saying, we think that power supply costs aren't going to be as high as they estimated, or the generation from a resource that they own, they underestimated the generation, and so they'll get more credit for that, and so they may need less. We also sometimes say, hey, they underestimated the amount of power supply costs that they're going to be here. We never say then they need another, more than they requested. The utility has to come back and do that, but we look at the filing and do a real deep dive on the structure of those costs. If there's disagreement, then there's kind of rebuttal back and forth. There's technical hearings in front of the commission. And then there's legal briefs afterwards. And then ultimately the commission makes a decision, and the rates go into effect or not. And that's all a lot of that is dictated by the statutes that are here on the slide. So it's a real in-depth process, and I wanted to mention it. There's there's been about 6 or 7 filings in the last several months for rate increases. They range anywhere from 4% to 14% increases. Those are they're big increases for Vermont. I can't remember if I mentioned this last time I was in, but in other states around New England, they're seeing increases of 100% and 200% and 300%. And right now, most of the requests we're seeing are driven by the power supply costs, so that big component of the rates, but also it's the market cost of energy has gone way up since Russia invaded Ukraine. And so it's just kind of a picture of how global supply or global market dynamics really kind of trickle down and affect us here in New England and then in Vermont. When natural gas prices get high, remember earlier I was talking about how the market worked, and people raise their hand and say, I'll sell you electricity for $300 a megawatt hour. Well, those natural gas plants, their prices to operate are going up, and they're saying, okay, well, now I'll sell it to you for $400 a megawatt hour. And then those prices can flow through to electric utilities. Now, other states around the region restructured about 10 or 15 years ago, their industry. So they purchase energy only in short-term increments, 6 months or 1 year. And so whatever the price is at that time, they're kind of stuck paying it. In Vermont, we did not restructure the industry, and our utilities can own generation and provide retail sales. And so that means, and they're also allowed to enter into longer term contracts, and that effectively hedges that risk of the market volatility going up and down. And so it doesn't completely hedge it. So those entitlements, if you think back to that generation slide, right? As a state, we had 17% that was unspecified. You can think of that on an annual basis as the amount that were subject to that risk on the open market, right? And that changes. The risk is different in the winter than it is in the summer and at different times of year, and the amount of open position is different. But Vermont has been more hedged against that extreme volatility than other states in the region.
Representative Pat.
I just wanted to add to what you were just saying, to point out that when the other states were moving in that direction, I had just become the general manager of Washington Electric Co-op, and that was an issue in front of the legislature at that time. And after a great deal of debate, the legislature said, no, we're not good. It would have required statute changes and all sorts of things, and the legislature said no. And we're the only state in New England that didn't go that way. So.
Okay. Next witnesses they are here. So I'm thinking that is a place for us to pause.
Can I say one more thing that I just on this slide, a lot of those power supply costs and rates, Green Mountain Power has a slightly different structure, and they have what's called an alternative regulation plan. And what that means is they still have this rate case process, but then in the interim, these power supply costs that I'm talking about, whether they're contracts or their open position, that moves every 3 months. So you may see your rate move slightly every 3 months because they're adjusting a little more frequently to account for some of these market dynamics, and that's part of their alternative regulation plan. So we go through this whole process for them every at least at least every 3 years, but it's been every year recently. And then every quarter, the department reviews their what's called their power supply adjuster filing and make sure that that's appropriate. And so you'll see their rates move a little more fluidly. And there's no return on equity, like their shareholders are not making any money on these adjusters. It's really the pass through of those costs. The way that Green Mountain Power investors make money is when they build plant. So they either build generation or they build infrastructure, poles and wires. That's how they make money. On the power supply costs themselves, that's all just a pass through to customers. And so we try and kind of match that a little more closely in real time to make sure that the utility doesn't get too far behind, before it files a rate increase, or it doesn't get too far ahead. If those costs go down, then ratepayers see that benefit right away. So I can stop there. 2 more slides. Up to you.
I think we need to move on. I suspect the next witnesses are going to other committees, so I don't want to
Okay.
back them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
11:40, 80. Not gonna amount to much.
So I will see you this afternoon.
Yeah, thanks so much. Wait, are they coming in? Weren't they right there? They were.
We did that well on purpose. What does it say about when you try to find absolute best?
About 5 minutes. I'm just gonna run the whole light.
Unhealthy.
We're lucky.
The truth be told, I would not care about electricity. I always fit into that. I
It's 2 hours.
I mean, friend of mine.
Yes.
He had-
My next jar is gonna be espresso. There we go. All right, this doesn't look like Sarah Adams.
She's capacity.
Yeah.
Are you ready?
Are you ISO? I just have one. So,
Oh, your cue.
yes, please. Yes, we'll have both of you sitting.
We delayed long enough that they're starting to change utility too, right? And then I was like, whoa, wait a second, Baltimore just had a 70%.
No, I read the increases.
Oh, yeah, I do.
Baltimore is so much fun.
Oh, I know.
Because the folks over there are so rich.
Okay. Are gonna shifting gears and gonna hear from ISO New England, Eric Johnson and Sarah Adams. Welcome.
Thank you very much. For the record, Eric Johnson from ISO New England, Director of External Affairs, joined by my colleague Sarah Adams, who's a state policy advisor. Our offices are located in Holyoke, Massachusetts. And we'll get into a short presentation that'll talk about our organization and a little bit about the resources that are used in New England to produce power and how we're seeing changes in that. And I'd also like to extend an invitation for committee members to come down and tour our facility in Western Massachusetts and give you a firsthand view of the bulk power system and the operations. So we've had lawmakers from Vermont come down and pass. They've enjoyed the time and the visit. And I know it's a bit of a drive, but I think it'll be worth it if you can.
We've heard that's a not to be missed invitation, so thank you for that.
So we'd be happy to take questions along the way. And if you could just tell us if there's any time constraints as we're moving along, we'll try to keep this.
Well, we have you until about 10 past the hour.
Okay, very good. So I'll start a little bit about the organization. ISO New England is the independent system operator for the bulk electric power grid in New England. We were created in 1997, and we are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or the FERC. So we're really a creature of the federal government. We work very closely with the states, but we're not regulated or formed necessarily by the states. And In New England in the 1990s, many of the states, with the exception of Vermont, were restructuring their electric industries to create retail choice for customers. At the same time, Congress was looking to open up the transmission system so that new companies could connect to the grid and supply power. So when we talk about restructuring, it was in part happening within the states within New England, but it was also happening at the federal level. So I'll primarily focus on the federal side of that. So I mentioned we're regulated by FERC. Our first responsibility is the reliability of the grid, making sure that the transmission system can serve whatever electricity demand the New England consumers have for power on a day-to-day basis, and then looking out into the future. And two things that are unique about our organization: we are independent of all the companies that buy and sell power in New England. And we have a code of conduct as employees. We have to divest any ownership interest, financial instruments related to any of those companies. So we truly are independent. That's the I in the ISO name. That's been true since the beginning of our organization. That also applies to our senior management team, and we have a board of directors that also abide by that code of conduct. So as we're overseeing a competitive marketplace, none of us have an interest in one company or another. And secondly, what's unique about us is we're neutral in terms of the types of resources and technologies that come forward. We essentially use the wholesale markets to bring forward the lowest price resources. We don't plan the New England power grid in terms of promoting one technology or another. We don't say we need to develop wind, or we need to develop nuclear, or we need to develop gas. Those decisions are made by companies that will make private investments in those types of assets. There's three major areas of responsibility. The first responsibility given to us in 1997 was operating the grid. And it was previously operated by an entity called the New England Power Pool. And we assumed responsibility from NEPOOL. So NEPOOL was created in the 1970s by all of the utilities in the region. They came together and operated and planned the system. But in 1997, the ISO was given that responsibility. So we've been doing that since the late 1990s. And you can think of the ISO as air traffic control for the power grid. Air traffic control makes sure that planes take off and land safely, but they don't own the planes. They don't own the runways. They're just balancing that system. And for us, we don't own anything out in the field. We own our control center, and that's it. We don't own any transmission lines. We don't own power stations. And our job is to make sure that the supply and demand is balanced perfectly. So every day we're developing a forecast for tomorrow. What time is New England going to wake up? How quickly are we going to increase the demand for power? When are we going to peak during the day? When are people going to go home from work? When are they going to start heating dinner in the evening? When are they going to go to bed? So we're developing, minute by minute, a forecast for the region. And you can see that on our website or on the mobile app. You can see how are we doing every day. So we tend to peak in the afternoon period. And so our job is to make sure that we're matching demand minute to minute. And we do that by calling power stations to turn on, turn off, or ramp up or ramp down. That's the operation side. The market function is a second area of responsibility. The FERC gave the ISO guidance to create a wholesale market. So in the past, the utility companies in the region, which were vertically integrated, they owned the generation, they owned the transmission lines, and they served the customers. And with restructuring at the state level, those companies sold off all of their generation. They just became a transmission company. And so we were given the responsibility to create a market so other companies that could come in, invest in New England, build power stations. And so when you hear about generation divestment, that's what happened in the 1997. The utilities divested their ownership in the generation, sold that off, and then what we would call merchant generation companies bought and then developed generation in the region. And then we simply provide a market for buyers and sellers at the wholesale level, that's the market administration function. You could, an analogy would be like the New York Stock Exchange. The stock exchange is not buying and selling, they're providing that platform for buyers and sellers. And there's also a pretty robust market oversight function that we do. We call it market monitoring. So within our organization, we have a team of people who are looking at every offer from a generator to sell electricity into the market to make sure that if they are a resource that's picked and setting the price, that they're not deflating their price, that their prices are competitive. So we want to make sure that the markets are producing competitive prices in every hour of the system. We do that internally, and then there's an external market monitor who is taking data from us. So that's another level of oversight. And then the federal government through FERC has a market oversight function. So while we design the market, we administer the market on a day-to-day basis, there's a lot of oversight of that market to make sure there's no gaming in the market, no market power, no market manipulation. The third area, power system planning, is responsibility for making sure that the transmission system can serve essentially what demand that we have as a region. So there's 14.5 million people in New England. We want to make sure that as we look 5 and 10 years into the future, as our demand is going to change, and Sarah will talk a little bit about what's driving that. We want to make sure that the transmission system can serve that. An analogy would be your highway department would do some forecasting of, well, how are highway and travel patterns going to change? Can the highways and the bridges support the travel of customers? We're doing that with the transmission system. But also within this area of responsibility is studying every power station that wants to connect to the grid. So if somebody wants to develop a wind farm, they would come to the ISO and they say, we want to interconnect our wind farm in this location. We would have the engineers evaluate it. And we're making sure that it's not going to create any adverse impacts to the reliability of the existing system. In some cases, it might put more power than the grid can handle right there. So we would establish some upgrades that might be needed in that area. And the developer of the wind project would pay for that. So it's looking really just at the reliability of the interconnection. And Sarah will talk about what types of resources are coming forward. We're not really looking at it from the perspective of, well, what should we build and where? That really is a decision of the market.
Can I just have, who is the outside agency, or you said someone else sort of checks on you under market administration? Who's managing that? You didn't say who's.
So a good question. So the firm is called Potomac Economics. David Patton is the head of that group. He's actually the market monitor for several ISO, so he has kind of broad visibility of these systems across the country. And his background is he worked at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, so he's been in a market oversight role for most of his career. And so he's hired by the ISO's board of directors to provide that oversight. David Patton, Patton, and Potomac Economics. So briefly thinking about, you have a question?
Very briefly,
Representative
this previous slide. So power system planning, studying, analyzing, and planning to make sure the grid needs will be met over the next 10 years. And the first thing we see are wind towers. So can you just help us understand what role ISO plays on, on new wind or new generation that we're trying to get on the system, if any?
Yes. So you can think of us as providing the screen before screening, meaning qualifying those resources to connect to the grid, just from that reliability perspective. And once we go through the study work to determine that they can connect without creating problems on the grid, a problem would be interrupting the voltage or overloading the lines. Those are the types of things that we're looking at. And once we've established that they can connect without those problems, or they might need to make a few upgrades to make that happen, then we would execute a connection agreement. They can connect to the system and then they can operate. Then they would go into a sort of a market role. They would buy and sell in the market. But they come first to the ISO and make sure from an engineering perspective, it can plug in reliably.
Okay. And so we have a lot of offshore wind in New England. So that's part of what you're working on.
I would say we have some offshore wind currently. We have proposed lots of it, and Sarah will get into that.
Oh, great.
If we think briefly about what we don't do, we don't have any jurisdiction over the retail supply. Now, of course, in Vermont, it's a different structure. You still have vertically integrated utilities. But in states that do have retail choice where you could choose the supplier that you want, that's all under the jurisdiction of the Public Utility Commission in each state, not necessarily the ISO. This is a representation of how other groups have either oversight of our organization or input to what we do. So it's a busy slide, but it's kind of an indication that there's a lot of interactions within the regional level. And I'll show you how Vermont is a part of this. The entities in red, I mentioned FERC oversees our operations. So anything related to our incorporation, our corporate structure, how we plan the transmission system, how we administer the markets, that all goes before FERC for approval. Once they approve that, it becomes part of what we refer to as our tariff. These are the governing documents for how we plan and operate the system. And then FERC has designated responsibility to a group called the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, to set reliability standards across the country. So we have to abide by those reliability standards. And then within different regions of the US, because there's different topology, the different types of resources, there are standards that are unique in the Northeast. And these would be things like making sure that you don't allow the transmission lines to be overloaded. Bad things happen when transmission lines overload on the bulk system. In your home, if we plug in the hair dryer and the microwave and the coffee pot, what happens is, a circuit trips because they don't want to overload the lines. On the bulk power system, there's no circuit breakers. So if the operators didn't manage the flow and look at the current on the system, the lines could become overloaded. So they're always looking at making sure that the amount of supply and demand are in balance, but we're not overloading the existing line. So those are reliability standards that are set by NERC. I mentioned our board of directors. We have an independent board that oversees our organization. We won't get into the details of that group, but their profiles are on the ISO website. There's a process for filling vacancies on the board through what's called the Joint Nominating Committee. And in New England, the New England states have a seat on that board to interview candidates for the board. And we have 9 members of the board, plus our CEO is a non-voting member of the board. Then to the lower right-hand side, you can see under the green categories, we have New England Power Pool, or NEPOOL. Those are the companies, unlike the ISO, that do own equipment in the field. They own the transmission lines. They own the generation. They could be municipal systems, large end users. And then we've had a lot of development of smaller resources. We put them in the category of alternative resources. So that's a sector within the NEPOOL structure. And Velco, for example, would be a member of NEPOOL. GMP would be a member of NEPOOL, and others in Vermont. So they're part of the market participant stakeholder community. While we're not regulated by the states per se, we work closely with the states to understand what policy objectives do the states have that will influence the future of the transmission system and the resource mix. So it's always helpful to learn what you are doing in terms of your renewable energy standards, so that as we're looking forward 5 and 10 years, we know, okay, how is the resource mix going to shift to satisfy your goals? On a day-to-day basis, our primary interactions in Vermont are with the PUC, Chairman Reisman, his other commissioners and staff, and then the Department of Public Service, so Commissioner Tierney and her team. So we work with them on a regular basis on all of these issues. So Vermont very much has a seat at the table in the regional discussions. Briefly, in terms of our mission, this really is the three areas of responsibility I had mentioned. And those are outlined in the governance documents that are approved by FERC. And it's a statement of what we do, what we have responsibility for on an ongoing basis. Our board in the past couple of years adopted a vision statement, which is more aspirational. So it wasn't submitted and approved by FERC, but it's a recognition that the states are looking to develop a transition to a clean energy future. And so we want to use the power of the competitive markets and the tools that we have for reliability to make sure we have a reliable transition to that clean energy future. So you'll hear about the, if you hear about the ISO's vision, it's really supporting the states as they make that clean energy pivot. If we zoom out, you can see that there's a big orange area on this map that encompasses New England and the Maritimes. We are part of a very large system called the Eastern Interconnection, which starts in the Rocky Mountains, covers the East Coast down to Florida. There's a separate interconnection called the Western Interconnection across the Rocky Mountains, and then Texas is its own interconnection called ERCOT. So these are the three in the US. There's also a separate interconnection called the Quebec interconnection. That's the dark gray at the top. So within the orange, just to use a little bit of technical terminology, we refer to this as an AC system, alternating current transmission. And so the power is essentially flowing on those transmission lines wherever there is the greatest demand. And then the ISOs are sort of balancing the generation and the load within each area. But within a system that large, it's one of the largest machines on the planet. If something bad happens in one area, it can actually affect another part of the system. And so we saw that in 2003. There was a blackout in the vicinity of Cleveland. They lost control of that system. And within a matter of 9 seconds, it had cascaded to the East Coast, and New York City went black. So that was a vulnerability within that system at the time. And Congress and the FERC essentially said that you needed to do two things. First, the ISOs, which operate the systems, need wider visibility on what's happening, not just within their borders. So if there's a problem happening in another region, they need to be able to detect that. Unfortunately, in that incident, the operators in Ohio didn't call the other operators to say, hey, we're having issues out here. They essentially waited too long and then became too late. And the other thing that came about is mandatory reliability standards. So if a resource commits to the ISO that they would be available and they're not, that would be a false representation. There could be serious reliability consequences and financial penalties for that company. So a lot of things change as a result of the blackout. As in life, sometimes it takes a crisis for big changes to happen. So a lot happened after that blackout. If you think about Quebec, we are connected to Quebec, but it's only through DC transmission, direct current lines. And DC lines, that technology, power only flows in one direction at a time. And so the primary flow between our neighbors to the north in New England is from north to south. We're an importer most of the time from Quebec. And that transmission goes pretty far north into Quebec up to the James Bay area for the hydro facilities. And we typically see use of DC transmission for moving large quantities of power over long distance. Internal to New England, all the transmission is AC. And we do have one other transmission line that connects to Long Island, which is DC. So if you hear DC, usually that's a connection between New England and a neighboring region. And if you hear AC, that's usually the transmission internal to our region. And on an annual basis, about 16 to 20% of our electricity is served by imports. So we produce a lot of electricity internal to New England with the power stations that are here, but we do import from our neighbors consistently.
Can I just ask a couple basic questions?
Sure.
How many other independent system operators are in our Eastern power system?
So in the Northeast, you would have ISO New England, the New York ISO.
The numbers. I was just curious how many.
I think there are 9 independent system operators across the country.
Okay, thanks. And
I
our,
can give you the specifics on
yeah,
that.
and our power didn't go down in that 2003 blackout. Can you sort of summarize why?
Yes, so the outage was really impacting the weakest part of the systems. So if you look on the left-hand side, you'll see that all of these lines, which are transmission lines, some of them cross over into the New York on the western boundary and Massachusetts, Vermont, and Connecticut. Many of those lines opened, the circuits opened up, so power stopped flowing. They detected some type of a problem, and that isolated New England. There were areas of Southwest Connecticut that were weaker in the system, and I'm not an engineer, but the engineers say it was sort of like the fuse. Southwest Connecticut became the fuse, and so parts of Southwest Connecticut went black along with New York City. So New England became an island in that period of time. And once they restored power in the rest of the interconnection, then they synced up the New England system with the Eastern interconnection again.
Yeah.
So it was essentially the automated separation of our transmission ties with our neighbors that shielded New England from total collapse.
So seems like something worked well for us there.
Yes, yeah, that worked well. Of course, I think that there are new tools that give us even better protections in those types of situations going forward. So I think I'm going to shift over to Sarah and let her talk about the changes in the resource mix.
Great. So New England has already seen really significant generator retirements, about 7,000 megawatts since 2013. And that's predominantly coal and oil resources, a few nuclear resources. You can see the orange on this graphic. And these days, we really only use coal and oil when it's very cold and it becomes economical to do so. And those generators are idle for most of the year, but they provide a really valuable winter reliability benefit in instances where the natural gas supply is constrained in New England. So if you take a look at the yellow resources, that's about another 5,000 megawatts of remaining coal and oil generation that's at risk of retirement that we would need to think about replacing in order to ensure that reliability benefit. When we think about planning for electricity needs, we're really thinking about the peaks, the peak demand on the system. New England is currently a summer peaking system. We made the switch from winter peaking to summer peaking in the early 1990s because of an increase in air conditioning. And we generally see summer demand peak on the hottest and the most humid days. And that is normally in the 26,000 megawatt ballpark. Peak demand on a normal summer day is more in the 18,000 to 22,000 megawatt range. And just for a reference point, our all-time system peak was set in 2006 at just over 28,000 megawatts. We'll get a little bit more into why that system peak hasn't changed in the last nearly 20 years, and it has a lot to do with energy efficiency and behind-the-meter solar driving the demand down. But as we look at electrifying buildings and the transportation sectors, we expect to see New England switch back to a winter peaking system. And that will likely happen by 2035. And just for a reference point on the winter peak, that was just shy of 23,000 megawatts, and that was set in 2004. Now, the switch and all of the electrification is being driven by state policies, and state policies and goals are just some of the inputs that the ISO looks at when we do our long-term planning. We're showing a couple different types of goals here. One is emissions reductions. Most of our states mandate greenhouse gas reductions economy-wide of at least 80% by 2050 from 1990 levels. And then the other one that we look at is renewable energy deployment goals. So you can see those called out here. And this is a good illustration of how we expect to see some of those requirements. Most of our states have a renewable portfolio standard, but in Vermont, this would be the renewable energy standard, actually manifest as far as deployment goes. So taking a look from 2020 out to 2040, it's obvious that we're going to have to develop really significant amounts of clean energy resources to meet the goals that the states are establishing for themselves. And Vermont is just shown as a call out here because the goals are so much higher initially that it skews the chart a little. So we just pulled them out. Now, this is a really good look at where we were, where we are, and where we expect to go with the annual energy output on the system. So if you look at 2000, that was the first year of the wholesale energy markets, compared to 2021. In just those 2 decades, the big change is natural gas. We went from about 12% of generation being natural gas to nearly 50%. And coal and oil decreased really dramatically, and we expect them to keep decreasing. Cumulatively, they're less than 1% now, but we expect them to really just completely fall off the map in the future. And if you look at renewables all the way over on the right, not a lot of change has happened between 2000 and 2021. So what you see in that green bar is we had recently done a study, the Future Grid Reliability Study, that modeled what our system might look like with a high penetration of renewables. So meeting a lot of those state policy requirements and goals. And you can see that we're projecting in 2040, more than half of our energy might come from renewable resources. And if you take a look at some of the other generator types, it's worth noting that demand, or that the electricity that we need, will approximately double. So we're not necessarily saying we're going to have less nuclear generators. It might just be a smaller percentage of the pie. So if you see some of these other resources going down, that might be why.
Question?
Yeah.
Representative Tory.
Quick question for
Yes.
you. On the previous slide, I just wanted to double check those goals, the state goals. Does that reflect, like, Massachusetts just passed this summer? They're new.
So this is capturing just the RPS, and then we refresh this whenever the states make a change in law. So it's current as of whatever date is shown in the notes. I'll have to double check to
Okay.
see if it captured the Massachusetts, but we update this annually, essentially at the end of the legislative sessions.
I have a question on this slide also. Explain why you took Vermont out and put it in a box? Like, I
Sure.
don't.
So Vermont is unique in the way it treats large-scale hydro as a renewable resource. That's a state determination. Most of the other New England states would not qualify large-scale hydro or imports from Quebec as renewable for their state RPS. And so it's just a matter of scale. It's at, I think it's at 59%, and then 75%. So actually, this other states have grown so much, we might be able to integrate that back in.
Yeah.
Right.
Should be
Yeah,
up there.
It
that's
looked like
interesting.
It fit in the scale. That's
Yeah.
why.
It used to be when we had it and the other states were down below. Vermont,
Initially,
Below the
Vermont
chart.
was way off the chart in 2020, but it looks
that's a good
like-
observation.
Yeah.
We'll take another look at that. But it was just designed to show essentially that what you treat as renewable is different from what the other states, and that's why there were some distinctions.
Yeah. I think you're maybe on the track I'm on. So Representative Sibilia.
Yeah, just a quick question. So, but if I'm reading correctly, it would appear that Rhode Island's pace is predicted to be faster than Vermont's pace. If I'm reading.
If you're looking at the 2035 and 2040 snapshots, yes.
Yes. Okay. And so we would be, in terms of getting to 2040, in between Rhode Island and Maine.
Correct.
Okay.
And there's been a lot of jockeying here. At one point, Rhode Island was near the bottom, Maine was near the bottom. Then you get a new governor, new policies, and suddenly the goals change. So we just try to keep up with what you're doing,
It's reflecting our goals. That's
reflecting your goals.
of the states, the goals of the states. Great.
States.
And I know others have questions. I'm going to just follow up on mine. So I guess I understand Vermont treats Hydro-Quebec differently, but that doesn't really change our goal. So explain to me why that changed. Why did that make your slide different? What make us different in your slide?
We're often asked about what is renewable. And so we would say that's a decision for policymakers.
Yeah.
And in terms of the RPS types of goals, Vermont is unique compared to the other states because it does treat large scale hydro as a renewable resource.
Yeah.
The other states don't. So in earlier iterations of the chart, people would say, wow, Vermont has much higher goals, but it was apples and oranges.
And it still kind of is, but the others are meeting their standard with different sources.
Correct.
Got it. Representative Smith.
Just to keep drilling on this, so do other states count large hydro in their clean carbon or some other goal rather than their renewable energy? Like, is it counted somewhere else? I mean, so is this actually,
So this is only looking at one policy instrument, which is the RPS or the RES. There are others, and Sarah talked on this slide about the other types of goals that the state set. In Massachusetts, they did a procurement to buy clean energy from Quebec and build transmission. It's the New England Clean Energy Connect project that's currently under discussion. So they would have been buying the equivalent of large scale hydro to come in to the region. So it wasn't the RPS, but it was another instrument that they used to buy that kind of power.
so that would not show up here because this is a policy statement about goals. It's not actually what's happening.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Pat and then Clifford.
On the renewables, are you able to, and how do you, if you are, include net metering behind the meter as opposed to purchased commercial scale renewable solar in particular, but it might be others.
The net metered resources are beyond what we can see on the system. So if you have rooftop solar in your home or business, it doesn't look like a source of power supply to us. It looks like a reduction in demand. So our operation of the bulk transmission system essentially stops at substations, and then the utilities have visibility and control below that.
And we do have a slide a little bit later that looks at what the impact behind the meter solar does look like to us as far as peak demand is concerned.
Was there another question?
Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So projection, correct? If considered projection. So, and this would incorporate Vermont's new mandates on like electrifying cars and houses. Does this
This
incorporate
is
that?
just about renewable energy.
Okay,
This particular slide.
okay, so it doesn't take into consideration what the new mandates would be for electrifying cars and houses in Vermont. Is there any projections on that?
We're going to get to that.
Oh, perfect. Yep. Thank you.
Anything else?
I'll let you drive.
Okay, so this is just a closer zoomed in look at the middle bar from the last slide showing what the net energy looked like in 2021. Most of the region's energy needs were met by low or no carbon emitting resources. At nearly half of this pie chart is from natural gas. About a quarter comes from nuclear resources. And then another quarter cumulatively comes from imports and renewables. So again, we do break out hydro differently. That's an additional 6% since Vermont is the only state that treats hydro as renewable. So the footnote here indicates what is included in that 10% of renewables. And imports is also predominantly hydropower that we're getting from Quebec. So these are all very clean sources of electricity as we transition away from oil and coal.
Can I just pause on that? If you look back in time in the 2000 timeframe, the coal and oil, which are really just slivers today, we're at 1.40% of this mix, and gas was much smaller. So when we say we're moving to cleaner resources, it's relative to what had operated before, not necessarily to say that gas is a clean resource, but it's clean in terms of its emissions profile relative to the operation of the coal and oil, just for some perspective on that.
And now this is looking more at what we expect the future resource mix to be. So Eric had mentioned our interconnection queue. Looking at the resources that are submitting to interconnect to the system is a really great glimpse into the future about what we might see coming online in the coming decade. So if you take a look at what we had in 2017 compared to what we're seeing this month in July 2023 or January 2023, it looks very different. About half of the queue in 2017 was natural gas, and now we're seeing half of the queue is wind. And more than a third is battery storage, which was not anywhere on the map in 2017. This queue is really driven by state policies. And again, this is not an indication of what will get built, but it's a good indicator of what is being proposed to get built And it gives us a sense of what the resource mix might be down the line.
So maybe to the representatives, is it representative?
Yes.
Okay, you asked about where the Massachusetts activity comes in. So if they do a procurement for offshore wind, it would show up in this.
And this is where we talk a little bit about what behind the meter solar does to demand on the system. So we're anticipating that we're going to need a lot more electricity as states electrify more, the building sectors and the transportation sectors. But we're seeing annual growth rates being mitigated by things like energy efficiency and behind the meter solar installations. If you take a look at this chart, this shows what the gross peak looks like. And then if we subtract out solar photovoltaic and energy efficiency, and you can see that without those measures, our annual growth rate would be about 0.7%. And with them, it's only about 0.3%. So that's about halving the annual growth rate that we would expect to see. And these types of factors, energy efficiency, solar, are a big part of why we haven't seen that system peak increase since 2006. And just for reference, if you take a look at where that 28,000 megawatt system peak would fall, you can see that we would be well above that if we are only looking at the gross peak line without subtracting out the PV and the energy efficiency.
So this will get to your.
Yes, so this is talking a little bit more about how the ISO forecasts the impacts of heating and transportation. We are definitely thinking about that. And in 2020, we did start including what we expect electrification to look like in our forecasts. The 2020 report, which is the capacity, energy, loads, and transmission report, was the first time that we really started running those numbers on what we expect electrification to do as far as electricity demand is concerned. And we expect that by 2050, the demand might be doubled as a result of electrification. And also we've got some numbers here on air source heat pumps and electric vehicles by 2031. So in about a decade, we expect about 1.1 million air source heat pumps and 1.5 million electric vehicles. And this also is a good illustration of why we might see the system switch back to winter peaking. If you look at the electrification bar chart, the winter needs compared to the summer needs are significantly higher. And this is because the batteries and the charging infrastructure is not as efficient in the winter. I think that's all right. So as we talk about that transition to clean energy and to electrification, as the reliability coordinator, we're very concerned with making sure that we can do that in a reliable and resilient way. And we've identified 4 pillars that will help us to achieve that goal. So the first pillar is clean energy. We really need significant amounts of clean energy resources to meet the goals that the states are proposing. And then we need balancing resources that will help us continue to keep supply and demand in equilibrium. For energy adequacy, that's a dependable energy supply chain or an energy reserve. So that's making sure we have the inputs to the system needed to balance out those intermittent generating resources like solar and wind. And in the future, that would be longer term duration storage. But right now it's making sure that we have a good natural gas supply chain. And then finally, robust transmission to interconnect that influx of renewable resources. And we've made a lot of investment in transmission in New England to date and are doing a lot of studies to make sure that we do have that robust transmission system. So that on that pillar, we're in pretty good shape.
So just a public service announcement. We got 15 more minutes to be with you.
Oh, okay.
And just because there's a lot here, I see. Our next witness can compress, because we'll hear from them again. Representative Smith.
Thank you. Could you back up one slide, please? I see you're predicting 1.5 million electric vehicles by 2031 in New England.
Yes.
How many are there now?
Very small number. So we're making that prediction based on looking at the state policies for electrification and doing a calculation of if the states meet their policy objectives, what's the energy required, and that feeds into the forecast. So the demand would go up by the amount shown on this chart if the states meet those goals. We don't expect that electric vehicles are just going to show up overnight. There's going to be a turnover of the transportation fleet. So we do this forecast every year. So if you make changes in your goals or the adoption rates increase or slow down, we update that into this forecast to continue to get good data. So we're not making just guesses on this. We're trying to look at the policy. We work with the auto manufacturers to understand what do they have in the pipeline for electric vehicles.
Right.
So it's an iterative process to develop this
All right,
forecast.
thank you.
Representative Torrey.
So it was just air source heat pumps. Is that because you're not seeing policy yet that would drive more geothermal district heating, things like that in the States?
So when we do the forecast, we wanted to start with something that we thought was achievable in terms of measuring it. And so air source heat pumps and light duty electric vehicles on the EV side. We've started to look on the EV side at fleets of vehicles in our forecast. And we're starting to broaden the types of heating conversions that are included in the forecast. So this is really where we started. And as I mentioned, each year we do a refresh on that forecast.
Go ahead.
So I think we're at a good stopping point. We can talk more about how we do transmission planning if that's helpful, but if there are questions that the committee has in the remaining time, I'll defer to you on how you want to manage
Sure.
the time.
Representative Sibilia.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I think that probably makes sense to pause here and maybe have folks come back in. And we should have you talk about the thing that I really love, which you have not talked about yet.
Oh, the app. Okay. I never talk about this at the beginning because people download the app. So on the ISO website, you can see in real time what's the demand for electricity, what's the fuel mix, and we have an app called ISO to go. And if you see on the screenshot, the left-hand side is a map of New England, and you can look at a screen that shows what's the wholesale price of electricity in your state at any given time. And the colors on the map change depending on if prices get high. Typically, prices are in the $30 to $40 per megawatt hour range. They can go lower than that if the demand for power is really low and we have an abundance of generation available. You'll have lower prices. If the demand gets really high in a cold snap where we're really testing the grid or a heat wave, we're using a lot of electricity, demand will go up, and then we'll have to turn on more expensive generation resources to meet that demand. And in those cases, the prices would be higher. And then the map would turn darker colors and you would see that indication. And then there's also a demand chart so you can see, across 24 hours of the day, what is the profile of New England's electricity use? And you can see how's the ISO doing. They have a forecast for the day, and then you can see the actual, are we over, are we under? So that's very transparent. You can follow that on the app. And then Sarah showed a few illustrations of the total energy use, and you can see that actually in real time. So most of the year when demand is relatively low, gas is producing most of the generation. If we get into a cold snap, the gas tends to contract, and oil and coal in those cases would be larger, typically only for the cold snap. Most of the year, those resources are not very efficient to run. So that's the app ISO to go. We urge you to follow that. There's also a news component, so you can track news from the ISO.
So, our previous witness explained sort of the push, like when there's demand or upward pressure on pricing, but can you help me understand why it sounded like what I heard was there'd be bidding for we can provide this. Why can't the grid absorb the lower prices and then add the higher? Why does everyone go to the higher price?
I'm going to guess you're talking about with the energy market that we administer every day. So imagine everybody here has some type of a power station that they could offer to sell electricity. And we'll say on this side, his price, maybe he's a wind farm. He'd say, I don't care what the price is. I'm going to offer for $0 I don't know if that's your resource, but I'll just, and then we go around and everybody's got something different, and your resource representative is the most expensive resource on the system. And we'll go throughout the day and we'll turn on enough resources until we meet the demand, and it may stop with you. Your resources might be enough. So everybody who is dispatched in that hour of the day would get whatever price is for that person who is dispatched. It's called, the concept is a uniform clearing price. So we're always dispatching the lowest price resources. Now, all of you folks say, well, I had power to sell, but there wasn't enough demand to get to you. And Sarah, I think, talked about our generation capacity in New England is about 30,000 megawatts, but on a day like today, we might be at 17. So those folks are not producing, they're not making any money. These folks who got selected would be paid that uniform price. Now, let's say
Everybody gets Larry's price.
everybody gets Larry's price.
Yeah. So that's what I'm not understanding.
So
Why can't you accept the 0 up to Larry's?
the goal of this structure is for every resource to offer in at their marginal price, and we get the lowest price in the dispatch. Now, you'd probably have to talk to the economist to understand all the theory behind that, but we don't want them to be guessing what the price is for everybody along this. They just want to we want them to offer in what is the lowest price they can offer to produce the next megawatt onto the grid. And then the pricing will sort that out. If we didn't have that uniform clearing price, he wouldn't offer 0 anymore because he would get 0. So he would say, now I have to guess what the price would be at the point where they match supply and demand. And that system is called a pay as bid. So you pay them what they bid. We think that would be less efficient because you're not really dispatching about the most efficient resources. You're basing it on his projection. And he would never bid 0 in a system that did the pay as bid.
Thank you. That helps me understand. Did you have the last question?
Yeah, just in a high level way, because I'm sure that's the only way we can get it. Can you just talk a little bit about security?
Sure.
What kind of things who you work with, and what we should know as an oversight committee in Vermont.
Very good. I think you can look at security probably in two ways. One is physical security. So we protect the physical security of the control center. It's the only building that we own. There's a security perimeter around that, but we don't own transmission lines and power stations. So everybody who owns those assets is responsible for the security of those assets. If you go to visit a nuclear power station, you're not going to get into that facility unless they admit you to that. The transmission system is exposed. So obviously there are risks in that regard. Sometimes people will try to sabotage the transmission system. Usually that involves investigations by law enforcement and the FBI typically. Probably a bigger concern for us at the moment is cybersecurity. So there's always somebody who's trying to hack into systems to interfere with the reliable operation of the grid. Now, I can tell you that the way we operate the system, all of those systems, they're not connected to the World Wide Web. So you may go into the ISO app, or you might see on our website, but that is not the actual grid. That's the corporate web interface. The grid itself is an isolated system. And so while we have a physical perimeter around our property, we have a cybersecurity perimeter and a team of people who are dedicated to monitoring that perimeter and perimeters within that system to make sure that people who want to do bad things to the grid aren't allowed to get in. I'll give you a couple ways we try to protect ourselves. Every employee is required to go through mandatory training. You may do this within your organizations as well. Sometimes the weakest link in the system might be somebody who clicks on a link inadvertently, right? And then you let somebody into your system. So we have training for that. And if you click the link, you're going to hear from your manager or somebody in your organization. We work in a unique place. We need to protect that system. If we're at a conference and people are handing out thumb drives, we don't plug those into our systems. You don't want to invite somebody in inadvertently. So we're conscious of the fact that there are people from the outside trying to hack in, but we don't as employees want to inadvertently let somebody in as well. So there's a great deal of monitoring on the cybersecurity side. Who do we work with? We work closely with the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI. If they have information about cyber attacks or physical attacks, they share it with the ISOs. If our colleagues in the other systems detect problems, they'll communicate that with us. So it's kind of an early warning system among the groups.
Who's assessing whether or not you're doing a good job? Like who is really kind of over, because we're not.
So good question. So FERC ultimately has jurisdiction over the ISOs.
Okay.
And so they look closely at that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Morris and then Tori.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm curious, you don't own infrastructure, you own a building, you have employees. Just curious about your revenue source. I mean, is it going to be, are you a federal program? Are you contracted by the distribution companies? Or do we see a charge, it's part of a charge on a customer bill? I'm just curious to.
Good question. So you wouldn't see a charge as a retail customer that says ISO charge because you're not our customer directly. So we recover our costs through a FERC approved tariff. So we develop a budget. We say, here's our revenue requirement to meet our budget each year. Our current budget on an annual basis is about $200 million to support all of our operations in both buildings. And we assess charges on all of the participants in the marketplace. Now, somebody who is a large participant would have a larger share of that cost. So we would go to FERC with a budget proposal, both for administrative and operating expenses and capital expenses. And they approve that usually at the end of the year. And then that becomes the source of our funding. There are two schedules, we call them within our tariff, that provide, the specific entities that collect that revenue, and then they would recover that for the ISO. So everybody pays a piece of it. If you took all of the electricity that we use in New England and divided up evenly, the cost of the ISO is about $1.12 per month per customer. So it's too small to show up in everybody's bill.
Okay, Representative Tori, one last.
Okay. This is kind of because the app got me
Okay.
thinking. And I own an EV.
Okay.
So, are we going to get to the point where people not only want to know that they're getting the best price when they charge, but also the cleanest energy? Like, how do we, or can we expect as consumers to know, hourly type of data about how clean the mix is at that point in time? That's something that I know our utilities would need to provide to us at some point. And I guess it would be you as well that would help make that manifest somehow.
If you think about the grid and the fuel mix there, as an example, if you plug your electric vehicle in today, unless you are drawing exclusively from solar panels in your home, you're pulling power off the distribution system, which is pulling off the grid. You may be driving an electric vehicle, but your energy source is whatever is the fuel mix at that time.
Which is, it says right here.
That's it. So that's what's power, or actually it's whenever you're charging.
Oh.
Whenever you're charging.
Right, whenever I'm charging. And so is that updated? Like how updated is this?
Oh, continuously. Yep.
All right, we thank you so much. We'll have you back if you come back to Vermont. Let us know. Otherwise, we can always have you zoom in and continue to learn more.
And Sarah, this is.
We brought some
Calendars.
resources. Well, this is our transmission map. If you would like some decoration for your committee room. And we also have a few postcards for some of our studies, which we didn't get a chance to discuss, but there are QR codes there for our pathway study, our strategic plan, and also our regional electricity outlook. So I will leave those behind if anyone is interested in those.
Great.
I'm interested in the map if you want to leave it out.
I'll come and give this to you.
I think everyone,
We're gonna fight over the, it's gonna stay.
everyone's interested in the map.
Okay,
It's
all
gonna
right, Madam
stay,
Chair.
stay in the room.
Thank you for your time.
Thank
you.
You can put it right on the table. Also, there is a compost bucket going.
Excellent.
I know most of this stuff.
Excellent. That's a good background. That's a good background.
Representative Clifford.
I got it all
We'd
warmed
be able to
up.
get a copy of their presentation.
Oh, yeah. Is your presentation, could you see this online?
I sent it to Catherine. So the material that we didn't
Yeah,
get to about our transmission information and our studies is all in there with links. If you have any questions about them, I will also leave a stack of my cards. You can reach out to myself or Eric about any of that material.
Great.
Or if you want to have us back.
Thank you.
I'll get it.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. And come down to ISO. We'd love to have you.
Where are you located?
We're in Western Mass,
Holyoke.
just 91 South.
That's close to you.
This is impressive. I was there a long time ago.
No,
It's
well,
impressive.
Thank you. Great.
Oh, I almost made one for you.
We'll get one. We know where.
We'll get you one.
Might be limited.
Our neighbor.
All right, committee, we're going to transition now to our next witness. This is Vermont Electric Power Company, Velco.
I have with me Hans Presame, our senior transmission planner. He's the director of transmission planning. He's the best transmission planner in the entirety of New England. My own little estimation, seriously, I mean that. Madam Chair, we just came from Senate Naturals, so I know we have a half an hour, and I think it would be good if I would propose to this, rock and roll through the testimony. And if there's any particular questions, which there very well might be, no one better on the technical questions than Hans, and I invite him to join me after I do this, and we'll go that way if that work.
That's great. And we, I mean, I know folks have some noon meetings, but we can keep going a little.
Okay.
Too.
Okay. Thank you again. So a couple of things. It's my first time in the committee. I don't know very many of you. Some I know more than others. I'll just say that. It's a pleasure. Just a bit about me. Grew up in Barre, Vermont. We owned a bakery. Went to Johnson State College, left in the Air Force, was an airborne cryptological linguist, did Russian. That was my job, translate Russian. Came back, dug ditches and worked construction for a few years. Went back to school, met a guy named Jeff Amistoy, who was running for Attorney General at the time. Somehow he took pity on me, so I ended up working with him. From that, I worked at the Attorney General's office for about 3 years. Started working at AIV, Associated Industries of Vermont, way back. It's kind of a different thing then, but for about 13 years, went to Central Vermont Public Service and was asked to join Velco at a time of the biggest capital expansion program that it had. I've been with Velco now about a total of 13, 14 years. I say total because I left for 2 years to go with a startup, which worked. And we sold the startup and I came back to Vermont and I love the mission. So I wanted to come back and they were willing to take me back. And I wanted to come back to Vermont and it's been joyous. So with that, Vermont Electric Power Company, a couple things I want to bring to your attention. Vermont has a lot of unique structures. Here's the uniqueness stuff about Velco. First transmission only company created in the United States in 1956. Created because Senator Aiken said, if New York is going to get federal tax dollars to build big hydroelectric dams on the St. Lawrence, they should have to offer a nice cheap block of power to contiguous states. Vermont wanted to take advantage. But you all have to build the wire in order to connect to get the power. Came to this legislature and by one vote, and it would create a public power statewide to build transmission or utilize the existing utilities and connect those utilities and build transmission. By one vote, it was, okay, utilities, you're on a short leash. Let's see if you can do it. And they did. That's how we were born. The local utilities combined and did that work. That's the history. What continues to make us use today, I would point out two factors. One, our governance and money. Governance, it's an incredibly transparent, accountable organization. We're owned by the state's 17 distribution utilities and a public benefits corporation, the Vermont Low Income Trust for Electricity. VLIGHT, as it's known, VLIGHT's role is to, by virtue of their ownership of us, they have a 30% ownership of us that was the result of the CVPS Green Mountain Power merger. That 30% enables them, they secure $1 million, about $1 million a year because of their ownership stake in Velco. And they also get to name 2 members to our board of directors. So every year, they're the ones that select, entirely independent process. They select who shows up, they get voted, and they serve on our board. And that happens on an annual basis every year, just like as an officer with a company, just like we're have to be up, re-enlisted, whatever you would call every year. So does the board of directors. The other thing, in addition to governance, that's what happens. The other addition to that is money. What makes us also unique is how our profits go. There is no other transmission utility in the nation that's structured our way. We are a for-profit, but we're structured like a co-op. And what that means is the profits we make go back to our distribution utility owners. But they, in return, are required to credit those dollars towards customers' bills. So put another way, for every dollar of profit that we make, every single grid-connected customer in the state of Vermont benefits. So what's our motivation? Our motivation is keep our people, community safe, keep the lights on, serve as effective financial stewards, and help Vermont advance its policy. About 152, 155 people were based in Rutland, have been ever since our founding in 1956. So that's a little bit about us. I had in the presentation that I sent a couple things related responsibilities. And you can see our vision and our role as we see right there. 2 things I would call out. One is the Vermont System Planning Committee. That is incredibly, I don't know if it's unique. I think various states have something like this, but effectively, when we built a big project called the Northwest Vermont Reliability Project, Chittenden County, it's controversial. We upset a lot of people. Between a combination of an investigation at the Public Utility Commission, it was the board then, and the state legislature that combined to create something called the Vermont System Planning Committee. That comprises regulators and consumer representatives and industrial customers and renewable energy developers and 6 or 7 stakeholder groups. Our responsibility is to provide them like a 20-year notice in transmission issues, such that if we can avoid building transmission through efficiency, targeted generation, some other strategy, we do so. Vermont, we have a statutory requirement to do everything we can to not build transmission, to find other creative ways to fix reliability problems. There is no state that requires more of a transmission utility, more steps to go through before you're allowed to build transmission. So just want to make that clear. The other thing is money. Our power accounting team manages throughput and contracts about $250 million a year to make sure that Vermonters are paid. They pay the money they owe for generation contracts or services sought, and they get the money they've earned from regional New England parties, whether that's a contracted renewable source, any other party. It just happens every single day. That kind of work goes on. So you don't hear a lot about Velco, but those are some of the roles that we do.
So
yeah.
Logistics, the presentation's up behind you. Kate can arrange slides when you want, and also it's up on the webpage, members. So
thank you, Madam Chair. If we could go to the, I guess that would be slide 3 or 2, managed assets title. Just a couple things about that. 2 things I would say. We have about $1.3 billion worth of total assets. One thing I would call to your attention, we have almost twice the number of miles of fiber optic network that we do electric conductor, which is unique. And in fact, Velco was one of the first, we were the first in New England to say, we see the benefits of where the grid is going. We see the benefits of having high speed, highly reliable, high volume communication networks. Now, I'd like to say that we foresaw all the sort of use cases and we did. But what that has enabled us is to better serve our customers, the distribution utilities, as they get creative and innovative and want to serve their customers. So when you have flexible load management, when you want to use Tesla Powerwalls, when you're trying to have vehicle to grid stuff, having that network such that you can move data instantaneously around the state is incredibly important. You really can't innovate if you can't move information. It used to be something nice to have, and then it became something, boy, it would be kind of difficult. Now it's indispensable. If you're going to maintain system reliability, you have to maintain communications. And that fiber reliability project is how we maintain system reliability. And because of the services we're able to provide the distribution utilities, they save roughly, conservatively, $20 million a year in services that they're not having to procure. love them, but having to procure from Verizon or other telecommunications companies where they'll have high reliability, but not the kind of reliability we have for something that's owned by the distribution utilities. So that's a bit about fiber on that. I think we have a statewide radio system. I guess I'm giving you a feel for transmission requires a lot of communication, the stuff that happens. The statewide radio system, both daily work and emergency response, preparation, and restoration. It's interesting. It was kind of born out of some real storms and honestly 9/11 and the need to have emergency responders and utilities be able to respond and coordinate response and communicate on a common platform. That radio system is incredibly important many, many times. Next, I'm looking at the slide with a map that has a legend. I apologize if it's a bit small. This really depicts everything. Here you can see where our fiber network is. Here you can see the various voltage lines, the transmission lines of what's going on. It's all there and it gives you kind of a chance. There's a lot of co-location and I'll get to it, mindful of time. This is really, we're in a period of fundamental transformation. It's a great time to be in the energy business. I mean, it really is. With that, I'm going to the current priorities to that slide. First and foremost for us, even as, okay, will we have enough energy? What are we doing? First for us is how do we optimize the existing system? There's still and yet a lot of inefficiency in the existing system. And that is born of a time when you didn't have data, when you didn't have fiber optic networks, when you didn't have connectivity to the various appliances, we'll call them, that are connected to the grid. You have to be conservative and have insurance policies. You have to have a margin of error. Well, ignorance is expensive because that means you're paying for a system more than you need and you're not secure and valid, nor is it as reliable as it might otherwise be. So right now with our fiber optic system, we're adding another 600 miles to connect. I think it's like 400, is it 400? I think the number's here. It's like 500 megawatts, but it's over 408, so 150 kW renewable energy generators and the like. We need to know where these generating facilities are, when they're on, when they're off, and how reliable, and if we can count on them. We need to, we're already going that direction, but the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, has told NERC, the North American Reliability Corporation, kind of like grid cops, they set the reliability requirements, and there's serious requirements. I mean, there's serious requirements due to a blackout. If we have a reliability failure that leads to an outage, there's an investigation and you can be subject to penalties, $1 million a day per penalty. I mean, this is serious stuff. The best way for us to maintain reliability is to have that vision, and now NERC is requiring that because in aggregate, the level, and you see it, the level of solar, whether it's customer owned or community owned or utility owned, all these things are coming up and they're having and good, they've arrived. And now they're a full participant in the grid, which carries with it responsibilities. We need to know more about you. We need to know what are your inverter settings, what's happening. A lot more will be coming on that. It's an exciting time, but we have to, it's really, I would say, encouraging, if not forcing, greater collaboration, greater sharing of data. And we're really fortunate to have the distribution utilities and the relationship, that transmission distribution utility relationship we have here in Velco, which is unique. I'll just note parenthetically that that's what led. We're doing some amazing work with 2 national labs, Pacific Northwest National Lab and Oak Ridge National Lab. Oak Ridge National Lab is precisely because there's no other place they have found where you have that relationship, the human relationships and the structural asset relationship between transmission and distribution. It's really, so there's exciting stuff that's happening there. So for the priorities is to optimize the existing transmission system, flexible load management. What can we do with storage? How can we get more out of what we got? We've already talked about the fiber reliability project. Here's some real transmission that we're building right now. And we put these here for a few reasons. Franklin County line upgrade project, 16.6 miles from Highgate to Georgia. Essentially what we're doing there is it's a reliability project. So Vermont pays 4% of the cost. Region pays about 96% of the cost. And I know I'm just throwing that out, but we can talk why that we're essentially 4% of New England's load. New England states are joined at the wallet. We all benefit from a mutually reliable grid. You should have to pay for the burden you put on the grid. How you calculate burden? You calculate that by what is the ask you have, the burden you place on the grid at peak when everything's firing. What's yours? We're 4% of the total load. Therefore, for reliability projects, we pay 4% of the projects necessary to keep the system reliable. Franklin County Light Upgrade Project is a reliability project. The new thing here that we did was, we call them structures or poles, essentially. You have side-by-side poles in the right of way. We could have just replaced it with the same structures. What we did was, instead of that, let's go higher. Yes, visual impact, but let's go higher. Existing right of way. It's been there like since 1957, one of the first lines we built. We'll go higher here, and we're creating a new corridor within an existing right of way that connects us to Canada and goes down towards Chittenden County. That asset in this environment, as we're seeking to decarbonize our power supply at scale, if we're going to electrify at the scale we're talking about, effectively doubling our load, we're going to need to leverage our transmission assets. Creating this is a really good idea. And the region's regulators from all New England states took note of this project and said, hey, all you transmission companies should be doing that. The reason is, if you're going to disrupt a neighborhood, if you're going to have all that work done, try and do it once. You should be trying to do it once every 50, 60 years. What's the most we can do to get out of that? Ideally, I mean, we have back and forth, honestly, internally. Ideally, I wish we had a project right now. So we're doing a reliability project, keep that. And I wish we had one right now that we would be able, we don't, but we're actively pursuing, and we have some partners, which, Madam Chair, maybe we can talk about some other time. Is there a way we can leverage that collaboratively with various parties? That's one. New England Clean Power Link, some on this committee are aware, it was really being pushed around 2014 timeframe. Short story is big 1,000 megawatts direct current line under Lake Champlain, comes up in Benson, and then it runs along the side of a state road, class 2 road in the right of way there, and then connects to one of our substations called the Coolidge substation in Cavendish, Ludlow. It's a sister project to a project that's already been approved, the Champlain Hudson Power Express, another 1,000 megawatts that's coming down Lake Champlain, but going to Albany. This project has had quite a history. The new news is there has been now New England interest and support for that line. That will be manifested. It's already been manifested in a previous filing. That will be manifested in a February 1st filing, along with the Transmission Developers Incorporated, TDI, the project developers, will file an application for transmission facilitation dollars from DOE February 1st for money for DOE to take up half of the energy off of that line. Effectively, they'll be able to commercialize the project. Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. I might miss one. Maine is a little bit, it's not so sure. New Hampshire, I think, is on board. That alignment of states is incredible for a transmission project. So that's real, that's coming. Happy to connect you to them. It seemed to be good. There's incredible benefits, one of which is $146 million for Velco that would come to Velco, but we would distribute that. So $146 million to mitigate rate pressures if this project goes forward. So it's a great low carbon source of energy. It adds jobs. It will help lower rates. They have a fund there that restarts and recapitalizes the Clean Energy Development Fund. There's a lake cleanup fund. Hell, I think there's a fire truck for Benson that's in. I know. Hey, look,
There must be something wrong. There's got to be there's a catch. There's a catch.
No, the catch is, right, it's what ultimately is the price you pay for the power. The good news, though, is it's coming through Vermont. So what does Vermont get for it? There's a laundry list of value and benefits that Vermont could get from this line should it move forward. Largely permitted. It will also spawn additional investments necessary to absorb this energy, which will do a great job to help in-state generation. That's why the renewable energy community in-state renewable energy community is supported, because they see the additional investments that'll take to the grid will also help foment and enable greater in-state renewable generation. So it's a fucking win. I hope it happens, but we'll see. So that's the other one. Then lastly, I just said active pursuit of other options. Where we can, every single tie, given the challenge before us, with urgency, we're seeking to leverage the things we have. And I would invite you to consider, you think of the map, we have the Empire of New York and the province of Quebec and our surrounding New England states. So we're right at this interesting geostrategic spot. We're a little state, and and the only one that didn't allow for competitive retail choice for energy. So if there's a lot more, if we have a unified vision, if we stay together and affect a vision, there's things we can do and a pace we can do that others simply can't. So frequently we serve our friends from ISO New England. A lot of times we serve as an innovation workbench for ISO New England. Let us try that. So we were the first ones to come up with a non-transmission alternative. We said, we don't want to build transmission. Here's what we can do, which was unheard of at the time. The Franklin County Line Upgrade Project. We took a lot of work to get their support because we were talking about spending more money to do this project, but the benefits far outweighed with the additional cost. But we had to give them empirical evidence, understand the methodology, and do that. So Vermont can play that role. Next, I'll just give you a little quick snapshot on Vermont's in-state generation. A couple of things I would say here, you'll see, no, actually, between that slide, and happy to answer questions, but I'm mindful of time. I'm going to keep rolling here and going to the next slide, Vermont generation performance at the peak hour. When we really need it the most, what can we count on? Where are the sources of energy we're counting on? Vermont we import energy 100% of the time. I mean, every hour of every day, we're importing energy. Now, some of that is changing because we have so much solar. Hans has taught me that when he looks at the analysis, he sees a time when we'll be exporting power. Our load will be so low and we'll have so much renewable energy, we'll be able to export. But you're going to need your means of exporting is through transmission. So you got to have a reliable network that can be able to do that. Here, one thing I would point out is, in addition to the criticality of our ties, like again, we're import dependent, not all the time, but certainly every hour it might not be at key times in the summer when solar is really burning, but we're very dependent. The other thing is biomass. Where they are and the power they provide, and when they provide the power, the McNeil and Rygate plants play a critical role for reliability. And again, that's our lens, right? Our first and foremost role is to keep the system reliable. We're agnostic. We understand in Vermont, we're going to be consistent with the rules, but small scale nuclear, biomass, and they have the requirements they have to do to be able to generate. We just want to make sure we keep the system reliable. So these are the facts of what exactly is on when we're at peak load. So I just wanted to, because sometimes that happens, just make that clear. Next, you see that 20-year outlook. As I said, Hans and his team produce a 20-year look ahead. 20 years, it's very, especially now, given the rate of change, it's very speculative. Hans and his team really concentrate on the first 10 years. We update this like a complete update every 3 years. I will tell you the one that was just done in 21. I think it's fair to say we had the most advanced tools for planning, most feedback, the most data, the most collaborative approach, and yet exactly where we're going to be, we're the least clear because there's so many things. What happens here? What happens with technology with storage? What happens with wars? The things that drive energy usage stuff, especially for 20 years out, they become increasingly speculative. So key takeaways. One of the things for us is, what would be ideal? Sometimes we get asked, okay, well, if you were designing the system, what would you hope for? One thing, for transmission, for reliability, given we've been facing reliability challenges, when we're locating generation, our thing is, let's give a little bit greater weight consideration to the bigger picture. Is this helping or is this hurting overall? Because you've seen what's happened in the Northeast Kingdom with where we have a constrained area. Cheap land, a lot of generation, skinny wires. So at certain times it's trapped and you can't get energy out. That's not a place, which makes national news. That's not a place where we want to be. We're trying not to replicate. And if we don't change some things, there's a possibility we could replicate that. So do that. Bring to scale flexible load management. In our opinion, we're very fortunate. And sometimes I don't know about this committee. Sometimes in some quarters in Vermont, lose sight of the fact that Burlington Electric Department and Green Mountain Power and Vermont Electric Co-op, in the group of utilities under VIPSA in their spheres. They're national leaders. And the like, of course, I'm a WEC member. I want to be clear about that. And Lewis is doing a lot of pressure, doing a great job. They're leaders in their field nationally. So the things they're trying to do with flexible load management, again, get more out of the system. Can we time? We'll have if we have the data, we can apply the analytics and we can leverage and make sure we get more out of sources here to feed load there. So we don't have to go to a very expensive spot market that could likely also is dirtier. Can we get more and how do we do that? It demands greater collaboration. It demands a lot of transparency and sharing about information, and that's happening, but there's more that's going to need to be done. Lastly, on that point on flexible load, I would say that there's been a spate of applications with the Department of Energy for concept papers for federal dollars under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. We'll see. We did a couple. I already mentioned the New England Clean Power Link. That's a ask of DOE to get money. We partnered with the Public Service Department and all the utilities did another application with them to use storage at every stage. This is pretty cool. To use a transmission grid level storage coupled with distribution utility storage, coupled with customer storage. If we can do all of that where it makes sense, when the cost and benefits work out, think of the power of that if we're getting really smarter about the ability to use energy in the most, capture all that you can when renewable energy is being generated and really use it when we need it up and down the grid, because we're not there. We're not there. So that's something that we're hoping to do. You see, in that issue of storage, love our friends at ICE. A continuing point of creative tension, I would say, is urgency, movement. And that's why we always frequently volunteer to be the test case for various things. So we're asking them to move faster on grid level storage, on bigger storage as a reliability asset. We're very grateful that they're proposing the changes they are. It's just that we're asking for, they put a cap on per project, they put a cap on overall, which is allowed in New England. Okay, what we're saying is you've already acknowledged that storage can serve this role for reliability, which kind of, you're already conceding the point that for this, and I'm trying not to be this use case, which relates, there's thermal and heat, oh my God, the system's bad, and there's voltage, there's not enough spinning metal. So you could have voltage issues. We want both use cases to be able to be, that storage as a transmission asset could be applied and used in those cases. Not there yet, we filed papers, gave them a heads up, we're gonna be filing these papers at FERC, we'll see if that happens, but we continue to work with them and we'll see. Lastly, Madam Chair, I would say this. We're going to try and do everything we can get out of the system that we have, even as we try and enact the policies that enable us to go where we know Vermont needs us to go and wants us to go. Those things are in play. We are building transmission now, and in our judgment, we're going to need more transmission if we're going to make the system more reliable, if we're going to be able to accomplish our decarbonization goals. The one thing I'd leave you with, it has to do as an example, a microcosm. The New England Clean Power Link was proposed in 2014. Same old, big line coming down one direction. The new thing about this project now is to reflect what is happening region-wide. If we have the offshore wind at scale, which we hope we do, it's going to be generating a lot of power, great. But a lot of it will be happening at the same time. So what do you do with the power that would otherwise be wasted? Is there a way where what could we do with that? If you look at the studies from Princeton, MIT, ISO New England, the National Renewable Energy Lab, what they have posited, and now the region is seeking to put into effect, is a vision that says Hydro-Quebec is huge battery. Offshore wind as a generating resource. When we need power, we pull down from HQ. When we have an excess, which there is some coincidence, we have excess power of offshore, we send it north. This comes at a time when there are increasing, fair enough. Quebecers are asking themselves, wait a minute. I mean, we're sending them, okay, we're getting a price, but what about, we have our own needs and we have our own economic development and the like, and that's happening. And so it's kind of up the bar on what we're bringing to the table and value for the grid. And actually that comes at a perfect time because with the advent of offshore wind, it just makes perfect sense to try and join them in as a balancing resource for each other. That's happening. Hydro-Quebec leadership wants to do it. The region's regulators want to do it. Quite honestly, I would say I've never seen the New England states now this aligned for a long, long time. You have the good people of Quebec saying, well, do we really want to, how much do we want to export? It still remains their key strategic objective. It's just a question of how much. That's who we are. So many people we have based in Rutland. Happy to answer any more questions. And I think that gives you a quick snapshot in a half an hour of what's going on, what's happening.
Yeah, thank you for your testimony. Representative Sibilia.
So I would just say thank you for compressing that.
Yeah.
There's a lot that we didn't hear. And, as we move into renewable energy standard, hopefully we'll be able to have you back in, hearing about the clean power link. We did hear some testimony from a self-identified public advocate last week.
Yeah.
Claiming that Velco is not a transparent organization or not publicly accountable, specifically looking at your fiber network. Can you talk to us about your public accountability?
Sure. First level of accountability. In order for us, this is a transmission reliability asset. So therefore, it's not quite the 96%, 4% because it's not a transmission asset. They call it general plant. So it's like 80-20. So still the bulk of the funds come from 80%. Like come from the region.
Bring this down.
Okay. This is a grid reliability asset. The people who paid for it to be built, we have to send information to them to say, here's what we're doing with the money. And there are 20 or 30 stakeholders at the New England level whose approval we have to get. And these are stakeholders, some very expert, some not at all. Public power, advocates, all kinds of people. What are you doing with this dollars? What are you going to do with this fiber network? Is it truly a transmission reliability investment? So there's all kinds of justification, documentation, work that has to be done to get it at the regional level. Next, we have to, in addition to the siting, wetlands and all the normal stuff we do in Vermont, all that, there is, if you're going to have a fiber network, essentially, as I understand it, and I'm not a telecommunications expert, but there's three basic doors. Are you going to offer retail service? Okay, that's self-explanatory. A lot of things go with that. We're not. Are you going to offer wholesale service to all? No, we're not. This is a transmission reliability asset. What we are allowed to do is file a statement of generally applicable terms on SCAD, and then we're allowed to negotiate as we deem appropriate individual contracts, which we do. I think we've done like 5 or 6 times. Those we typically don't share. You're absolutely right. Part of that is we don't want to give people, here's how much we're charging them, because that's a matter of negotiation. I would point out to the committee, every negotiation, though, we have a requirement, which is in the case of transmission reliability need, I understand we told you could use these pair of fibers, but we're going to stop your use and we're going to take it back if we have to for system reliability. And there's still telecommunications companies willing to live with that requirement. So, you have on the map where our fiber network is. Yes, there's a contractual arrangement. Some of them, we don't make every single thing. Look, here's how much we charge this person. But the money is looked at, and all those kind of agreements are looked at through our board of directors, which comprises individuals, again, named to it by the Vermont Low Income Trust for Electricity. So whether at the regulatory level, whether at the regional level, whether at the permitting level, whether at the contract execution level, I just don't think that holds water. That's what I would say. But I'm glad to answer any other question.
I think I have a more basic question about fiber. How does your fiber optic network relate to the retail, the ones that we're working to get to everybody's house?
Fundamentally, we're a little bit early adopters, so there's a lot of middle mile fiber now. So we were one of the few for a while, but now there's a bunch. But where it does make sense, essentially, we're helping to buy down the cost of connection. If there's an agreement that can be reached with someone who wants to connect the households with us as part of their backbone, we can do that. So our relationship would be essentially as a carrier, we'll wholesale carrier, we'll bring it from here over to here to help you. And like I said, we've done that. Also, what we've sought to do through our Vice President for Technology, Dan Nelson, local boy from Montpelier, went to VTC, serves on the Vermont Community Broadband Board. They have where we can, we have collaborated with the various communication union districts, whether it's purchasing or information. There's a lot that was learned out about this. And not every utility really had a good map of where their poles are. Not everyone knew. It's not surprising. especially some of the places that need broadband the most are some places that typically haven't benefited from continued investment of resources. They're not Chittenden County. So there's a lot of work that has to be done. So I would say, Madam Chair, our role has been where we can help reduce the cost of transport of data with someone who is going to connect, because we're not a last mile provider, but we have worked collaboratively with people who are trying to help them drive down their business costs.
And so your broadband or your fiber it's there, and is it available in every union district, or is it no?
Again, I always go back. The purpose is to serve transmission system reliability. So there's some places where there's a logical connection. Do we have currently unused capacity that we could devote to that use? That's a consideration. Frankly, it's also has been who's ready to actually do a deal with. I would say the communication union districts are a different level of sophistication, maturation. So where it makes sense, where they want to come with us, they all know. In fact, that was like 2 years ago when this first happened. We were agitating to try and get a statewide communication union group formed so we would have one entity to work with. We said, look, here's our system. Here's what we could do. Who wants to play with us? We wanted them to form a statewide association. They have. We worked with Rob Fish. We continue to work with those people, but it's really on a case-by-case basis, depending on where it makes sense for the capital structure, the plan that these people have, the pace of the build-out they have. I would say that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Further thoughts, members?
Well, don't be a stranger and invite us back, because my man Hans, if you want to go deep, like on the impact, seriously, I know I'm being flippant, I'm sorry. If you want to understand the impacts of like some of the policies and stuff, there is no better resource to help you like understand impacts of various proposals than Hans, President.
Great. We will definitely take you up on that. And thank you. And thank you for doing this twice this morning. I'm sorry we couldn't do a joint hearing. That would have been more efficient.
Yeah, but it's a different vibe. It's kind of I don't know somebody. So thank you. It's a great opportunity.
That's very politically correct to you. We prefer the vibe over here.
Wow. Okay, I'm just going to treasure this moment. I was being politically all right. Thank you very much.